We all want to build confidence, pursue meaningful goals, and break limiting patterns. But we often hit the same bottleneck again and again. Our nervous system interprets certain situations and opportunities as threatening. And once that threat response kicks in, it triggers anxiety, avoidance, overthinking, narrowing our options, and suddenly we shut down. And sometimes we do that long before we even take the first step into the situation. So we disregard opportunities, situations before we even go into them because it's kind of out of our reach. Not because it's dangerous, but because our mind predicts it will be. The key point here is that the problem is not the discomfort itself, it's the learned association between discomfort and danger. And also when we avoid situations that activate anxiety, we do an avoidant behavior that reduces our anxiety, right? We don't do what's scary. That will bring a temporary relief. And that temporary relief feels really good for the brain. It says avoidance works, do that again, that feels good. But over time, kind of your repertoire of behavior gets smaller and smaller, and your life becomes more restricted. You become less flexible, less adaptive, and more constrained by habits that block growth. And if this happens to an extreme level, then we start to see a clinical condition, and it's kind of maybe time to seek out a therapist to work with this. It can, for example, be with phobias, where people have such an extreme fear of spiders, heights, or things like that, that it takes over their entire life. Then you need to work with it in a clinical setting. But these things also happen on a smaller scale in everyday life, just in a different degree, but it could still be important to look at. Today, I want to talk about one of the strongest empirically tested methods within psychotherapy, exposure therapy. A lot of the methods and the different techniques in psychotherapy can sometimes have a little bit dubious results. They sometimes work, they sometimes don't, and sometimes we don't really know why it works in certain situations and it doesn't work in others. But exposure therapy is actually one of, if not the kind of principle and technique that is kind of most rigorously tested and empirically kind of sound and proved. So this is something that actually really works, and we can say with a very high degree that this is just actually kind of facts. Very rarely we can speak in true facts in psychology, but this is kind of one of those cases. I'm super excited to share this because, as I said, super strongly empirically tested, and kind of giving that as a tool for everybody to use, not only in a clinical setting where you have kind of these specific conditions like phobia or very, very crippling anxiety, but that is a principle of anxiety that can work for everybody. And that is super interesting, and it becomes a reliable way to actually use clinical methods of psychotherapy in a reliable way in your everyday life to get results. And it's not super dangerous, I would say. There are some caveats, some traps I will talk about later, but the principle is neither very complex, and if you kind of use it with common sense, I don't really see a problem why you should not be able to kind of use this in your everyday life. So what is exposure therapy? It is a technique, a method that in large kind of deals with and explains anxiety, how the mind and the body kind of treats it and reacts to it, and kind of what it needs in order to overcome it. And it is in large based on learning principles, which a lot of the cognitive branch is as well. So this is a technique that is a little bit more common and used in the cognitive branch of psychology. At the core of it, we have something that's called inhibitory learning. This means that the brain doesn't erase old fear associations. Instead, it forms new ones that compete and outcompetes the old ones. And here's how that works. This essentially means is that if you place yourself in a situation that triggers anxiety and you stay long enough without escaping it, your nervous system receives new data. It learns that the predicted catastrophe did not happen, that there is a mismatch between the expectation and what the reality was, and this is kind of the prediction error. And it's one of the strongest drivers of neural learning we have. So we are really kind of retraining our brain through our experiences. One of the core ideas and findings is that anxiety, like emotions, have a curve to them, meaning that they are not constant. Sometimes it feels like that, and when we enter a situation, time kind of slows down and our anxiety becomes very high. It feels like it's going kind of to last forever. That's what it doesn't. There's actually kind of also a neurochemical perspective to this, where we cannot produce those anxiety chemicals for an infinite amount of time, but rather there is an escalation of the anxiety, and then there is kind of a peak of the anxiety, and then it plateaus a little bit and then it goes down. And usually we withdraw or avoid the situation long before we kind of go to the peak and go over to the other side. So we withdraw when we are kind of on the rise, and that is kind of what we don't want to do. That is the theory, that if we can kind of tolerate going all the way up to the peak, staying through the peak, and kind of learning that anxiety goes down, that we could handle all of this, that gives a lot of new kind of pathways and training for our body and our mind. This ties into one of the core mechanisms of tolerance building, or expanding the window of tolerance. When you repeatedly engage with manageable levels of discomfort and anxiety, you increase your capacity to stay regulated in situations that previously overwhelmed you. This is essentially stress inoculation. Controlled exposure to challenge builds resilience over time. Here I said repeated, and that is important. Research studies is very clear that doing it once is usually not enough to kind of get this huge anxiety bell curve to kind of drop immediately, but rather it is the repeated amounts of time we do it that will give us this gradual result where anxiety lowers a little bit for every time. So if you do it in a clinical setting, maybe you expose for whatever you are afraid of, maybe 10-15 times. There's also the physiological mechanisms, the recalibration of the autonomic nervous system. When you enter a situation that activates your sympathetic arousal and kind of activates the fight and flight system, and you stay in it long enough, then eventually your parasympathetic system will kick back in, the calming part of your nervous system, the one that is regulating you down. And that kind of trains your body to be able to down-regulate on its own more efficiently. So over time, your physiology becomes less reactive and more adaptable. And none of this is limited to clinical anxiety. These mechanisms apply everywhere. The thing is that usually the more narrow and specific the situation is, the stronger evidence is that the exposure will work. So if you are afraid of like legitimately everything, you can't really, that's kind of hard to expose for. In clinical therapy, you usually expose for one specific thing. If you're doing like phobia exposure, then it's like the spider, it's the height, it's the whatever the phobia is. But if you think about it, what you have anxiety over and where you can have a little bit of creativity and vision, you can always break down the different aspects or find or create a specific aspect that you could expose for. Usually if we are interested in personal development, growing in one way or another, it means in one way to kind of go into the unknown, to kind of take risks, do new things, and doing that kind of always spikes anxiety because the mind really hates the new and uncertain. So usually with block out opportunities before we even kind of see them as an opportunity or a possibility, because the mind does not want to engage with that level of anxiety. But if we have this as a tool, then a lot more opportunities and paths kind of open up, because now the anxiety that kind of blocked the door for this before, that said that it is not possible, suddenly becomes a little bit more possible. This is something that all successful people have experienced, and people with ambitions usually learn one way or another, and usually they talk about it in hindsight and how they found out the hard way that growth required them to slightly step out beyond their capacity. But here we're kind of giving you the heads up and the roadmap of this instead, and that every time you do that, your nervous system updates its model of what is tolerable, manageable and safe, and it can also start to see opportunities in kind of going for what is a little bit unsafe, that is a little bit anxiety triggering, and if we can learn that we can work with it instead of just being kind of triggered by it and not being able to do so much about it, and we have that little thing inside of us that actually likes to work with that anxiety, that activation, because we see the reward and the fun to kind of do expand our window of tolerance and being able to handle more situations, then we can make it a little bit fun. Then we can kind of seek out these experiences a little bit more instead of always kind of wanting to avoid them. And if you can master this, it almost become a little bit of a hack, but then you need to have that kind of inclination where you actually want to kind of do this process repeatedly and kind of like using exposure therapy in a way where you challenge your anxiety. But if you do that, then things open up a lot. But also if you have specific areas and you want to kind of reach goals or have a vision, don't want to step into the situations that kind of feel discomfortable for you and feel out of your reach, then you can use this as a tool. You have to take all the steps to kind of get to your goals, but at least you have a roadmap and it becomes a little bit more clear kind of what is expected of you, what you kind of will feel, and kind of what you have to go through, and a little bit what the more expected curve is. The discomfort, the resistance, the activation, and then the eventual recalibration. Lastly, I just want to say a few contextual things and also a common trap. First of all, exposing yourself for whatever kind of triggers anxiety in you is always discomfortable, so there's no kind of point in doing it unless you feel like it's a situation that you either really want to or need to kind of engage with. So for example, if there's a situation that you know provoke a lot of anxiety in you, but you have no interest in really working on that situation or really kind of engaging with that situation, and it doesn't really cause you any hindrance in your life, then maybe there is no real point to kind of do this kind of process with it. Then it's maybe better to just leave it be. Kind of only doing this for things that you actually want to kind of work with and reduce your anxiety level for, where you can kind of have a vision where you can see that if this was lowered, I was able to tolerate more, then that would be good for me. Then a common trap is when doing exposure therapy is that you don't kind of expose sufficiently for the anxiety, that you're kind of 1 foot in, 1 foot out. So if you want to do it properly, all research kind of suggests that you kind of need to kind of step into the situation to some degree, full in, or at least aiming for that eventually. Maybe first time you can be taking 1 step forward towards it, and then you can do another and another, but the full effect comes when you kind of learn to emerge in the situation kind of completely. And your mind and your body will find all kind of different ways, and it will come up a lot in you strongly when you approach the situation, especially if you have strong anxiety with it, to kind of withdraw, distract, or kind of, pull you away from that. situation. So when I'm a psychologist and I work with a situation, for example with phobia, then I would tell the patient that now I want you to tell me all the ways in which your mind and your body will try to escape the situation. If you notice that you kind of mentally disappear from the situation and go into your thoughts, if you notice that you want to kind of turn your body away from the situation, if you notice that you start fidgeting with things, that you want to talk with me as a comfort, if you kind of want to take up your phone or whatever it is. So that is kind of the same that you need to do, that you need to be very aware of the things that your mind and your body will kind of try to do in order for you to kind of not experience the anxiety or the situation fully. So the more you can kind of experience the situation fully, the better you'll have of this effect. And of course, if you do it repeated amount of times, you can do this gradual step where you are allowed in the beginning to kind of do a little and distract yourself, and then the next time you can kind of increase your capacity. So that is totally fine, but it's an important thing to be aware of, that body and mind will hit you with these things. So exposure therapy, when applied correctly, isn't about forcing yourself into overwhelm. It is rather creating the correct learning conditions for your brain so that it can update its old prediction model. And when you do that, you gradually build psychological and physiological capacity, two of the most valuable inner resources you can develop. And with that increased capacity comes new opportunities, paths, choices, and possibilities that were previously maybe completely cut off because anxiety was too loud can now begin to open up. As I said, this is a clinical method that is kind of a powerful tool, and it can be used in everyday life by everyone. And if you're interested in personal development, like we are on this channel, try it out. Take a scenario, a situation that maybe is not that threatening to you, and just kind of play around with it. And the more you have vision and creativity with it, the more you can also benefit from it. If you are interested in kind of using tools and knowledge from psychology to use that for personal development, to get a better life in one way or another, and also if you are, as me, a little bit interested in kind of tangible results, performance and success, then this is kind of all I talk about. If this is something that you also like, and you kind of also have a passion for this intersection, then subscribe for more. See you in the next video.